An upscale restaurant in the city center, evening lights glowing warm. A man sat alone at a table set with a single rose. 20 minutes passed. No one came. Servers glanced at each other, smiled softly. He was about to stand when the door opened. A woman entered wearing a black evening dress, eyes hollow. She sat down, said quietly, "Sorry I'm late." Just as he began introducing himself, she whispered, voice trembling, "Don't go. Tonight you're all I have left." He froze, looking into her eyes. Behind the smile was pain unspoken. Daniel Reed, 37 years old, single dad, lighting systems maintenance engineer. Lost his wife 3 years ago to cancer. Lived with daughter Lily, 8 years old, who loved photographing sunrises. Daniel was the quiet, gentle type. Always woke early to make coffee and write a small note for his daughter's lunchbox. Be kind, even when it hurts. His best friend signed him up on a dating app. You need to get out. Can't live in darkness forever. He reluctantly agreed to his first date in 3 years. Meanwhile, Clara Voss, 30 years old, fashion designer, CEO of a luxury brand, had just lost her fiancé in a traffic accident. She'd agreed to this date at a friend's urging, just to feel alive again. Wearing the dress he'd given her, she walked in with swollen eyes but maintained confident posture. When they met, the atmosphere was quiet. Daniel said, "I didn't think you'd come." Clara replied, "Me neither." He smiled gently. "I've never been good at starting conversations." She looked down. "I've never been good at ending pain." When the server asked, "What would you like to order?" Clara answered, "Just water. I can't eat much." Daniel looked at her gently. "Then I'll order soup too, so the table won't be cold." They said very little. But when the stage lights in the restaurant dimmed and jazz music played, she blurted out, "Don't go. Tonight, you're all I have left." Daniel was silent. In the candlelight, he saw tears rolling down her cheeks. But Daniel's presence at this restaurant wasn't random. It was desperate. 3 years ago, he'd been Daniel Reed, senior lighting designer at a major fashion house. He'd designed stage lighting for runway shows worldwide, had been passionate about his work, had loved creating moments where fabric and light merged into art. His wife, Margaret, had been sick for 2 years. Breast cancer, aggressive, treatment after treatment failing. And Daniel had kept working, kept traveling because someone had to pay the medical bills. Someone had to maintain their lifestyle. Someone had to pretend everything would be okay. Margaret had understood. "You need to work. I'll be fine." But she hadn't been fine. She deteriorated while he was in Milan setting up lights for Fashion Week. She died while he was in Paris troubleshooting a technical failure. He'd gotten the call from Lily's grandmother. "She's gone. She asked for you. You weren't there." The guilt had destroyed him. Not just grief, but the crushing knowledge that he'd chosen spotlights over his wife's final days. That his last conversation with Margaret had been about delayed flights and technical specs, not love or gratitude or goodbye. He'd quit fashion immediately, couldn't face the industry that had kept him away, had taken a simple maintenance job, fixing streetlights and building systems. Work that didn't require passion. That let him be present for Lily. That didn't tempt him to sacrifice family for career ever again. For 3 years, he'd lived small, deliberately small. Lily and simple routines, no ambition, no risks, no possibility of failing the people he loved again. This date was his first attempt at anything beyond survival, and he'd almost canceled. Had stood outside the restaurant for 10 minutes, debating whether he could handle connection again, whether he deserved it. Then he'd seen Clara arrive, seen her pause at the door, gathering courage, seen the way she held herself together despite visible pain. And he'd recognized it, the performance of being okay when everything inside is shattered. So he'd stayed, not because he was ready, but because she needed someone to stay. And maybe so did he. Conclusion of Act 1. He didn't ask more questions, just reached across the table, gently took her hand. No comforting words, just warmth. It was the only way he knew to say, "I'm still here." The restaurant owner later said, "They barely spoke that first night. Just sat holding hands across the table. I've never seen silence say so much. After the date, Clara didn't disappear as he'd expected. She sent a brief text. "Thank you for not leaving." He replied, "If I'd left, you'd be sitting alone. I've sat that way before." They began meeting every Friday evening, eating simple dinners at small restaurants. She told stories about school days, passion for design, but being seen as dreamy. He told stories about single fatherhood, teaching his daughter to fold paper airplanes to send dreams flying. Clara was surprised. "You still believe in beautiful things after losing someone you loved?" Daniel smiled softly. "If we don't believe, how do we live?" One evening, she invited him to her design studio. He looked around at gorgeous dresses covered in dust. She said, "I haven't touched them since he left. Maybe they're waiting for you to forgive yourself." She looked at him, choking up. "I don't know where to start." He replied, "From the first stitch." Clara began designing again for the first time in months. Every evening, Daniel came to fix lights, replace outlets, bringing lunch boxes from his daughter. She teased, "You can't cook, but you bring good food." "Lily makes it. She says grown-ups also need good food to be less sad." But their connection deepened through shared understanding of grief. One night, Clara confessed something she'd never told anyone. "The night before the accident, we fought. Terrible fight. I told him his dreams were unrealistic, that he needed to grow up, that I was tired of carrying the financial burden." What was he trying to do? He wanted to start a nonprofit, teaching art to underprivileged kids. I said it was naive, that we had bills, that dreams don't pay mortgages. Daniel listened without judgment. The accident happened the next morning. He was driving to meet potential donors, trying to prove me wrong, and I never got to take it back. Never got to tell him I was just scared, that I believed in him, that I was wrong. "You weren't wrong to be scared. You were just human." But he died thinking I didn't believe in him. Or he died knowing you loved him enough to worry. Fear comes from love. He knew that. She cried then, really cried. Not the polite tears she'd allowed herself in public, but deep, wrenching sobs. Daniel held her, said nothing, just held space for her grief. When she finally calmed, she said, "How did you do it, survive losing your wife?" "I didn't for a long time. I just existed. Went through motions. Lily's the only reason I'm still here. She needed a father, so I became one, even when I didn't know how." "Do you still miss her?" "Every day, but the missing has changed. At first it was drowning, now it's companionship. Like she's still here, just in a different way. Watching, hoping I'll be okay." "Does it ever stop hurting?" "No. But you learn to carry it better. The weight doesn't change. You just get stronger." Clara had never met anyone who spoke about grief so honestly. Most people offered platitudes. "Time heals all wounds. He's in a better place. You'll move on." Empty words that meant nothing. But Daniel spoke truth. Pain doesn't disappear. You don't get over loss. You integrate it. You become a person who carries sorrow alongside joy. You learn to live with ghosts. One Friday, Clara brought Lily a gift, a small sewing kit with her initials embroidered on the case. Lily opened it, eyes wide. "This is so pretty." "Your dad said you like making things. I thought maybe you'd like to try sewing. Can you teach me?" Clara looked at Daniel, who nodded. "I'd love to." They spent that evening together, Clara showing Lily basic stitches while Daniel fixed a broken lamp in the corner. It felt domestic, like family, like something Clara hadn't realized she'd been missing until she had it. When Lily fell asleep on the studio couch, Clara covered her with a blanket. "She's wonderful. You've done an amazing job." "I've done my best. Some days that's not much. It's everything. She's happy, confident, kind. That doesn't happen by accident. Margaret deserves the credit. She was the good parent. I was just present, finally." The regret in his voice broke Clara's heart. "You're being too hard on yourself." "Am I? I miss my wife's death because of work. That's not being too hard, that's being honest. You were providing, trying to save her." I was hiding, using work to avoid watching her die. And I'll live with that forever. Clara took his hand. We both will live with our failures, our words we can't take back, our absences. But maybe we can live with them together, make the weight lighter. He looked at her, really looked, saw not just beauty or pain, but possibility, the chance to build something new from broken pieces. Clara met Lily one afternoon. The little girl gave her a drawing of her dad holding hands with the blonde lady in the black dress. Clara asked, "Why did you draw me sad?" "Because you haven't been hugged yet." Clara broke down crying. Clara gradually fell in love with Daniel, but she still hid a secret. She'd been the person behind the fashion corporation where Daniel used to design lighting. Her company had cut the contract that cost him his job 3 years ago. Knowing this, she feared he'd leave her. One evening, Daniel was invited to install lighting for a major fashion show, CV Atelier brand. When he walked backstage, he froze. Clara was directing the show, wearing the legendary black dress. Everyone bowed. "CEO Voss, we're ready." He stepped back, realizing Clara was the person who'd caused him to lose the job he'd loved most. After the show, he left, leaving behind a note. "Thank you for teaching me to trust again, but some wounds can't be stitched back." Clara read it, tears falling. She searched for his small apartment, but he'd moved. In the mailbox, she found a small letter from Lily. "Miss Clara, don't be sad. Dad says anyone who can sew clothes can also mend hearts." First twist. Clara found Daniel again at a community exhibition where he taught children to make handmade lanterns. She brought a white dress with hand-embroidered words on the chest. "Don't go. You held my hand when I'd lost everything. Now it's my turn." He was silent, eyes softening. Second twist. Clara apologized to him in front of all staff. "I once destroyed what you loved, but you taught me to love myself again." She invited him back as director of lighting and stage design for the brand. He replied, "If the light is warm enough, any darkness fades." Their year-end show became a global hit. The audience stood and applauded when words projected on the wall. Designed by Clara Voss, lit by Daniel Reed, inspired by kindness. But the confrontation had been far more painful than the reconciliation suggested. When Daniel had seen Clara at that fashion show, commanding the room with authority, wearing designer clothes that cost more than his monthly rent, he'd felt gutted. Not by anger, by betrayal. She'd known. For weeks, she'd known who he was, what her company had done to him. And she'd said nothing, had let him fall for her while hiding the truth. The contract termination 3 years ago hadn't been random corporate downsizing. CV Atelier had been restructuring after Clara took over as CEO. She cut all external contractors, brought everything in-house to reduce costs. Standard business decision. But for Daniel, it had been devastating. He'd been freelance, dependent on that contract. When it ended, other companies had already filled positions. He'd been blacklisted, essentially, not through malice, but through industry reality. No one needed his specific skills at that specific moment. He'd lost income right when medical bills were crushing him, had lost his identity as an artist right when he needed purpose to survive Margaret's death, had lost everything that made him feel valuable, and Clara had authorized it, maybe not personally, maybe just signed off on a restructuring plan. But her signature had ended his career. When he'd left that note, he'd been drowning in the unfairness. That the first person he'd opened his heart to in 3 years was the architect of his downfall. That the universe was cruel enough to make him love the person who'd hurt him. He'd spent that night walking the city, rain soaking through his jacket, phone buzzing with Clara's calls, texts, voicemails. He'd ignored them all, had needed space to process the betrayal, the coincidence, the cosmic joke of it all. At 3 a.m., he'd found himself at Margaret's grave, first time in months, had sat on wet grass, talking to stone. "Tell me what to do. She destroyed my career, but she brought me back to life. How do I reconcile that? How do I forgive someone for breaking me when she's the one who helped me heal?" The silence had been answer enough. Margaret couldn't tell him what to do. This was his choice, his life. his decision whether to let the past define his future or let the present redeem them both. He'd moved that same night. Couldn't bear the thought of Clara finding him, of having to have the conversation, of seeing pity or defensiveness or excuses in her eyes. But Lily had insisted on leaving the note. "Dad, she didn't know it was you. And even if she did, she's sorry now. You taught me forgiveness. Why won't you do it?" "Because some things can't be forgiven." "Says who?" "Mom forgave you for not being there. She told me before she died. Said you needed to forgive yourself too, and you never did." The words had shattered him because Lily was right. He'd been carrying guilt for 3 years, never allowing himself grace, never believing he deserved forgiveness. And now he was doing the same to Clara, holding her accountable for a business decision she probably didn't remember. That had affected him but wasn't personal. Clara, meanwhile, had been falling apart. She'd called everyone, his landlord, his friends, had even filed a missing person report before learning he'd simply moved. The rejection had been crushing, not because of ego, but because she'd finally opened her heart after her fiancé's death, and the person she'd chosen had left without giving her a chance to explain. She'd discovered the connection 2 weeks before the fashion show, had been reviewing old contractor files for a lawsuit defense, seen Daniel's name, recognized the address, put it together, and she'd frozen, hadn't known how to tell him, had been terrified of losing him, so she'd hidden it, hoping somehow he'd never find out, knowing that was cowardly, but doing it anyway. When he'd walked into that fashion show, when their eyes had met across the room, she'd seen the exact moment he'd realized. Seen his face go from surprise to recognition to devastation. And she'd known. She'd lost him. Through her cowardice, her silence, her inability to be honest when honesty was required. When Clara had found him at the community center, holding her white dress with "Don't Go" embroidered on it, he'd wanted to stay angry, wanted to protect himself, but he couldn't. Because she'd shown up, hadn't made excuses, hadn't defended herself, had just stood there vulnerable, asking for a chance to make it right. "I didn't know it was you," she'd said. "Not until 2 weeks ago. I was reviewing old contracts and saw your name, recognized the address, put it together, and I've been terrified ever since. Terrified you'd find out and hate me. Terrified I'd lose the first person who's made me feel human since I lost him. You should have told me. I know I was selfish. I wanted a few more weeks of happiness before losing you. I'm sorry, truly sorry. Not for the business decision, I can't change that. But for not being honest, for letting you trust me while hiding something so important." Daniel had taken the dress, read the embroidery, seen how the stitches were imperfect, clearly hand-sewn by Clara herself, not a professional. Hours of work, a physical manifestation of regret. "This doesn't fix it," he'd said. "I know, but maybe it's a start. Maybe over time you can forgive me. And I can forgive myself, and we can build something from the wreckage." He'd looked at her, at the woman who'd accidentally destroyed his life and intentionally rebuilt his heart. And he'd made a choice. Let the past define him or let the present redeem them both. "I'll come back, not as your employee, as your partner, equal footing. We rebuild together or we don't do it at all." She'd nodded, crying. Equal partners. They'd shaken hands, then hugged, then cried together in the middle of a community center surrounded by curious children. A photographer captured them embracing. Clara in her white dress, Daniel in his work clothes, surrounded by lanterns made by children. The photo went viral. When love survives the unforgivable. 1 year later, Claire and Daniel together launched Light and Thread Scholarship Program for underprivileged children who loved the arts. Lily served as little ambassador, beaming at the opening ceremony. Claire spoke, "I once thought art was luxury, but it turns out it only needs 2 things, light and hands." Daniel replied, "When someone says don't go, maybe they don't need rescue, just someone who stays." Symbol of rebirth. The program logo was a hand gripping a thread of light, engraved, "Stay, even when it hurts." At a small party, Clara danced with Daniel. He said, "Can you have dinner now without apologizing?" She smiled. If you're there, I don't need to apologize for anything. But the program meant more than charity. It was atonement. Clara's way of fixing what she'd broken, not for Daniel, but for everyone like him. Talented people crushed by corporate indifference. They'd started small, 10 scholarships, basic supplies, partnership with local arts center. But the response had been overwhelming. Hundreds of applications. Kids from poverty who drew on napkins, who sewed with dental floss because they couldn't afford thread, who dreamed of stages they'd never seen. The selection committee couldn't choose, so they expanded. 20 scholarships, then 50. Then Clara had done something radical. She'd restructured CV Atelier's entire budget, redirecting 10% of profits to lighten thread permanently. The board had objected. This impacts shareholder value. Good, Clara had said. Let it impact us. Let us earn slightly less so these kids can have a chance. That's what business should be. Daniel had been in that meeting, had watched Clara stand firm against pushback, had seen her evolve from someone who made decisions based purely on efficiency to someone who valued humanity over profit. You've changed, he told her afterward. You changed me. Showed me that the cost of success was too high if it meant destroying people. Now I want to build instead of cut, create instead of eliminate. The first scholarship recipients had graduated recently. One girl, Maria, had gotten into Parsons. Another, James, had been hired as a junior lighting designer for a Broadway show. Their success was Clara and Daniel's success. At the graduation ceremony, Maria had spoken. I thought fashion was for rich people, people who looked like magazine covers. But Ms. Voss and Mr. Reed taught me it's for anyone who has something to say, who wants to create beauty in a harsh world. They gave me permission to dream. And then they gave me tools to build those dreams. Lily had been so proud. Dad, you're like changing lives. No, kiddo, I'm just holding doors open. They're doing the walking. But nights were still hard sometimes. Daniel still woke at 3 a.m. missing Margaret. Still felt guilt that he'd found happiness with Clara when Margaret never got to see Lily grow up. Still wondered if he deserved the second chance. Clara understood. She had her own 3 a.m. demons. Moments when she reached for her phone to text her fiancé before remembering he was gone. Days when she saw something beautiful, and her first instinct was to share it with someone who couldn't receive it. They'd learned to text each other in those moments. Missing them today. And the reply was always the same. Me too. Want company? Sometimes they'd meet. Sometimes they'd just text back and forth until dawn. Sometimes silence was enough, knowing someone else was awake with ghosts. Grief didn't end, but it evolved. Became part of their foundation instead of their prison. From this day forward, I choose to stay when I want to run. I choose presence over perfection. I choose to believe that staying can heal more than leaving ever could. I will be the light that doesn't go out. One rainy evening, they returned to the restaurant from years ago. Same table, same chairs, same candlelight. She said, "That night I thought I was alone." He replied, "That night so did I." Lily sat beside them, drawing the two holding hands. "I'm naming the new show, okay?" Clara smiled. "What name?" "Don't Go. It's Where Love Stayed." Final scene. The light in the restaurant reflected on the faces of three people. Clara leaned her head on his shoulder. Narrator's voice. Some hands don't save the world, but saving one person is enough to make the world less cold. But the real ending came 2 years later at their wedding, not a big affair. Clara had wanted simple. Daniel had insisted on meaningful, so it was small. Close friends, family, and 50 scholarship recipients who Clara and Daniel considered extended family. The ceremony was held in Clara's studio, the same place where Daniel had first told her to pick up the needle again, where she'd begun healing. Where they'd fallen in love surrounded by fabric and light. Lily was flower girl, wearing a dress she'd sewn herself with Clara's guidance. She scattered rose petals with theatrical flair, making everyone laugh. When the officiant asked for vows, Daniel spoke first. "Clara, I came to that restaurant broken, ready to go through motions. You whispered, 'Don't go,' and I stayed. Best decision I ever made. You taught me that survival isn't enough. that life after loss can still be beautiful, that I deserve happiness even when I feel guilty for wanting it. I promise to stay, in hard moments and easy ones, in grief and joy. I'll stay. Clara's turn. Daniel, you held my hand when I had nothing left, when I was drowning in regret and guilt. You didn't try to fix me or rush me or judge me. You just stayed. Presence was your gift, and it saved me. I promise to stay too, to be present, to choose us every day, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. To light your darkness like you lit mine. They exchanged rings, simple bands engraved with "Stay." When they kissed, Lily shouted, "Finally," and everyone laughed through tears. At the reception, they premiered a fashion collection designed jointly, the Don't Go collection. Every piece told a story of staying, of choosing love over fear, of presence over perfection. The centerpiece was a wedding dress, white with black embroidery, the same Don't Go Clara had sewn years ago, now incorporated into art. It would be auctioned, proceeds going to Light and Thread. As the evening ended, as guests departed, as Lily fell asleep on a pile of fabric samples, Clara and Daniel stood in the empty studio. "We did it," she said, "built something beautiful from broken pieces. We did, and we'll keep building, because that's what staying means, showing up, choosing each other, creating light." They slow danced to silence. No music needed, just heartbeats and breathing and the sound of rain on windows. Outside, the city glowed. Inside, two people who'd been alone had found home in each other. Not perfection, not absence of pain, but partnership, presence. The sacred act of staying when leaving would be easier, and in the morning they'd wake up together, make coffee, write notes for Lily's lunchbox, go to work at the studio, teach kids to sew and light stages, live ordinary lives made extraordinary by choice, by the daily decision to stay, to be present, to love despite loss, to believe that sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is simply not leave. If you believe staying can heal more than leaving ever could, share this story and subscribe. We tell moments that remind the world that love sometimes begins with 3 words. Don't go, please.